This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor, as always, to be a part of the Democracy Group. That's a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're putting whole segments up there with video. We have links in the show notes to make it easy to find. And of course, follow us, review us, join our Patreon. It all helps so we can continue having great conversations like the one we are having today with Carl Allen. Carl Allen is a researcher and analyst of sports and political data. His current research interests include inefficiencies in political betting markets and improving polling methods. He is also the author of The Polls Weren't Wrong, which we discussed a few weeks ago when Carl joined us for his maiden visit. There it is. The polls weren't wrong. He came on the program, great conversation. But today, we're less than 2 weeks away from Election Day. I just wanted to get down to the nitty gritty, talk about who's going to win this damn thing. So, Carl, how you doing, man? Thanks so much for coming on again. How you doing?
I am doing great. And as much as you're going to try to twist my arm, Corey, you know I'm a good analyst. I don't make calls. I don't make predictions. I'm happy to talk through these states with you, and we can work together and do some analysis.
Yeah. You know what's funny is in the last 3 or 4 days, people have started asking me straight up, like, who's going to win? And I don't want to give a yes or no answer. I don't want to give a Harris, a Trump. Because what I'm like, my answer now is, do you want to have a conversation about it, or do you want me to just tell you what you want to hear? So I'm much more interested in the analysis and how we think through what's actually happening in this election right now. So
exactly. I had a chat with a friend the other day. I said, you know what? If I had fewer ethics, I could probably sell more books by telling people what they wanted to hear.
Yeah.
But it's just not in me. It's not in my nature to lie to people. And that's one of the things that I really want to fix about this field is to think about things in a rational way.
Yeah. So before we dive into it, how's it? The book came out a few weeks ago. You're getting great testimonials from some folks I respect more than anybody in the country. How's it been going so far with the book?
Man, it has been going so well. I'm talking to a lot of people. Some people who I was skeptical would enjoy the book have really, really liked the book.
Yeah.
There are some people who can't put their name on an endorsement because they have to play the politics of, hey, I want to get a job here, or hey, I have to play nice with this person and I can't attach my name to your work because, you know, we talked about earlier, Spicy Carl doesn't hold back. Like when I think I'm right about something, or when I know I'm right about something, I don't play nice. And I don't think we should have to. So on that end, things are going very well. And more than that, I really, really want this book not to do well just for this election, but the applications for the lessons in this book should be taught in universities, even in high school. Some of the stats lessons, political science lessons, this stuff could be taught right now, at least starting next semester. It really is that organic and it is that impactful. And that is my big picture goal.
That's awesome. Well, at least in terms of this one unofficial student of yours, that being me, it's kind of like you can't unsee what you now have seen. So, I'll watch Harry Enton, for example, or, just any one of the other high profile guys on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. And they're doing these things where I'm looking at the charts they're showing. I'm like, but what are your numbers? You're telling me the spread, but you're not telling me the actual numbers. You just can't unsee it. So
isn't it infuriating? Isn't it infuriating? And I can't tell you how many people have said that exact same thing. They're like, before they read my book and before they read my analysis, like, Carl, you're really passionate about this. You repeat the same thing so often. Maybe you should tone it down a little bit. And then they read my work and then they compare my work to the work that's currently being done in the field. And they're like, I think you're kind of nice. Like, you're too nice about some of the things that you say, because the analysis that they're doing is so poor.
Yeah.
And it is directly misinforming the public.
Yeah.
That is the biggest thing that bothers me, is when the public is being misinformed about the state of any given race. And then bigger picture, how polls work in general.
Right.
That infuriates me.
Well, we had a pretty good intro a few weeks ago when you came on the show. So, like I said, I was sharing with Carl what my thinking was for this episode, since we're so close to the to election day. What I'm going to do today is go to some specific states for the presidential race. Then if we have time, look at a couple of the Senate races, maybe even look at the House. But the way I want to do it today is to look at some polls. And just for ease of use, I'll be using the 538 interface. And I'd love to share my thoughts on how I'm looking at those polls, some of my quick takeaways. Like I said, more like I'm a student in one of your classes. And then if you're, if Carl seems to be up for the challenge, Carl will give me some feedback on how I'm thinking about these polls, and then we'll hear some of Carl's own analysis and what he's seeing. So you're still game, right?
I'm in. Let's do it.
All right, cool. I am going to see if this works. I'm going to share my screen so that we're both looking at the same thing. All right, cool. You can see that, right?
I can now.
All right, awesome. Expand this. All right, so now you see all my show notes actually, right? So let's just go directly to, well, starting with Pennsylvania. A lot of folks are saying that's the swingiest of swing states. It's what the race is largely hinging on. So you could see this. I opened directly to the 538's main interface. Now, one thing I caught myself already doing is I'm scrolling immediately past the averages, because what I want to do is I want to go down to the specific polls. So here's what I'm seeing. I see I don't know, about a dozen polls here, and I'll tell you a couple of my first quick takeaways. I have looked at this sometime a few days ago, so I had an expectation, but there's some new polls here. So I'll tell you what, one of the first things I see, second from the top, is Trafalgar. I forget how you say it. I have no interest in what Trafalgar says. The data that they're showing, I have zero interest. I don't know if that's just my own biases or prejudices, but it's basically like the sense I get from the little I do know about Trafalgar is that number one, he doesn't share his work, so that makes me immediately suspicious. But two is, I always know that it's going to be a very Trump-friendly poll, so it just it just makes me immediately suspicious. If I were to take a look at it and forget that it says Trafalgar, I'll tell you a couple of other things that jump out at me. One is, I like that, and I didn't necessarily get this from you, but tell me if you disagree. But likely voters. And over 1,000 likely voters sampled, surveyed. So that's a positive. That's a pretty healthy sample size, and I prefer likely voters to registered voters. So those
pros and cons. We can talk about that in a minute.
Okay, all right. But then the other thing I see is that 43 and 46, Trump being, quote unquote, you hate this, up by 3, as they put it here. I don't care what that is. The thing that I see immediately there, 43 and 40, am I reading that right? I don't have my glasses on. 43 and 46. So that means there is 3 plus 7. So there's 4 plus 7. So there's about 10 points of wiggle room right there. So my question is,
here's sorry, go ahead. What's your question?
No, my question there is, I wish there was more information. What's happening in the 10, between 90 and 100%? What makes that up? Is it registered voters? Or excuse me, is it undecided voters? Is it folks who are voting third party? I'd love to know more about what makes up that 10%. That's more so than Trump being, 46 and Harris being 43, as many analysts, as you point out, incorrectly say that's a 3-point spread. The biggest thing that jumps out at me is what makes up the 10 points that we don't know about there. So,
perfect.
Okay, so
give me some feedback. I can tell you're a good student.
Yeah.
Because you resisted the urge to say Trump plus 3. And that is the number one thing, is that little line there on the right. And then if you go back to the top, how they summarize the presidential race and the Senate race. Plus this much is a terrible, terrible metric. I just wrote an article on my Substack recently called The End of the Spread Method. We are actually living through history right now, and you're part of it with me. I relate the spread method to the geocentric model of the Earth, which is the Earth is not the center of the universe, but for 1,000 years, some brilliant scientists came up with math to justify, to make sense of the Earth is stationary and the center of the universe. And the spread method kind of has followed the same pattern of, well, it was wrong about this, but if we look at the numbers this way. So the spread method, if you want to learn more about why that's a terrible way to look at polls, you can read that on my Substack, you can read that in my book. The numbers in that poll, Trump 46, Harris 43, and ignoring for a minute that it's Trafalgar, and they are very, very partisan and not a transparent pollster. That remaining 11% is either third party or undecided. Either third party or undecided. We don't know from this data. One major problem, and I talk about in my book, it's very important, a person who says they are going to vote third party and a person who says they don't know who they are going to vote for are very, very different people. Very, very different people. Just to give you for example of why that's the case. If someone declares in a poll that they plan to vote for Jill Stein, who is the Green Party candidate who tends to be strongly favored on the left and not the right, if someone says, I plan to vote for Jill Stein, it is more likely, if they change their mind, that they would lean more towards Harris than towards Trump.
Okay.
And then if we rewind to 2016, Gary Johnson, the libertarian candidate, well, he's a former Republican. If someone declares in a poll they plan to vote for Gary Johnson, if they change their mind, it's more likely that they will vote for Trump than for, in 2016, Hillary Clinton. The third party and undecided are very different calculations. We don't know how many people said third party, how many people said undecided. But what we do know, this year, unlike 2016, there are very, very, very few people who will vote third party.
Oh.
That number, depending on the state, will probably be anywhere from a few tenths of a percent, maybe up to 2% in a couple states, Michigan, Alaska, but we can get into that in a little bit. One very important calculation that I make, that anyone needs to make when they're analyzing poll data, is how many votes does this candidate need to win? What percentage of the vote does this candidate need to win? I define that as the finish line.
The finish line, right.
Finish line, yes. In every race, because the most votes wins, 50% is the finish line. If a candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, or 50% or more of the vote, they win. In most states, that finish line will be around 49.5%.
Okay.
So I consider a poll that shows a candidate at 49% or above to be relatively strong for that candidate.
Yeah.
Polls like this, 46, 43, just because Trump is ahead, that doesn't tell us a whole lot. And on the note, and while we're digging into the meaning of these polls, different pollsters ask questions different ways.
Right.
Which means if a pollster asks, if the election were today, would you vote for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? Some pollsters, if you say, I'm not sure yet, they go, oh, okay, not sure yet, undecided, got it. But some pollsters say, okay, I understand that you're undecided, but if you had to choose, who would you choose? Some pollsters ask that follow-up question and some pollsters don't. So you might notice, and I can't see it on my screen because it's a little small, but I would wager that somewhere on this screen, there are polls with, say, 2 to 3% undecided. And then there are others with, look, it broke out the third party.
Yeah. There are a couple here. So Redfield and Wilton Strategies, the Telegraph and Atlas Intel have a couple of drop downs. And just for listeners that aren't on YouTube, so the Redfield one has 48 Harris, 48 Trump, 1% Oliver, 0% Stein. That still leaves us with three. And again, forgive me if I'm using the wrong term, but 3 points of wiggle room. We don't know what the rest of the three.
Undecided.
Yeah, three. So is it? But right. So we can better determine that those are three undecided because this poll asked about third-party candidates. We see 1%, 1 point for Oliver, 0% for Stein. So we can better, but that 3 points makes a huge difference. The 3% of undecideds that we can better, it's at least closer to knowing that it's undecideds because they asked about the third party.
Exactly. They asked about the third party. And in that case, with 48-48, they also probably asked if you had to choose which candidate would you lean towards.
Right.
And when we talk about asking or how to best ask poll questions, there's not really like a formula for it. It's really a preference of the pollster. If you give the option to someone on the phone or in a survey, they're clicking a button, if you give them the option to be undecided, they're more likely to state that they're undecided. But if you ask them a follow-up question, there are pros and cons to that methodology. So when we look at some polls that have 10% undecided and other polls with maybe 2% undecided, those aren't irreconcilable.
Okay.
Those can both exist. Both of those pollsters can be good pollsters. Then it gets into how they ask the question.
Right.
How they ask the question gets into why there could be such a discrepancy there. So Trafalgar, again, not a good pollster. They're not good. Not just because they're partisan, because weirdly enough, some partisan pollsters still do decent work. But Trafalgar is one where they're not transparent with their data, so I prefer not to use them. I look at what they're doing to see if they're fixing their methodology issues, but that's one where I don't even consider them. Qantas there at the top, they're slightly better, but they're very new and they lean very partisan as well. Atlas Intel, it's hard to get a read on. I do include Atlas Intel in my poll averages.
Okay.
Because they are more transparent, but they're not listed as partisan here, but they do seem to be rather partisan with their numbers. So it's hard to quantify how partisan or how biased a pollster may be. But when we're just looking at the numbers, when we're just looking at the candidates' numbers, in an election like this with very, very, very few third-party candidates, the main thing that we're looking for is how close the candidates are to 50. Not in one poll, but consistently. Are they consistently in that range?
Right, right. So as I look at a few others, Morning Consult has a pretty good reputation. The Washington Post, George Mason, again, of the two that they're offering, I look at the likely voters, good sample sizes, over 700 with the George Mason one, almost 1,400 with Morning Consult. These are from about a week or so ago. And Morning Consult has Harris at 49, Trump at 48. George Mason has Harris at 49, Trump at 47. The other one, Atlas Intel, you mentioned. So that's another one that has a drop down. Harris, but again, you said that they seem to be partisan. But I'll share anyway. Harris 47, Trump 50, Stein 2, Oliver 1. Now, to me, that looks a little fishy because they got to 100%, which based on what you just said, if I had to make a guess now, I would guess that they asked the question so that instead of allowing for any undecideds in this poll, they got to 100% decideds in that poll. So that it maybe not fishy, but it raises a question in my mind about those.
In an election like this with fewer undecideds, especially now that we're very close to the election, that isn't a red flag for their methodology.
Okay.
But it does. You should maybe not consider the weight of those numbers so heavily. For example, just to give you for example, if a candidate is polling at 50%, their competitor is polling at say 46%, and then the rest are undecided, that 50 with 4% undecided carries more weight than a 50% with 0 undecided.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because again, that 50% with no undecided leaves the wiggle room thing that you said.
Yeah.
If that 50% is an overstatement, well, there's no way for them to make that up now.
Right.
To make up that difference if that 50% is an overstatement. Whereas if there are 6% undecided and the 50 is an overstatement, or sorry, 4% undecided, if the poll is 50-46 with 4% undecided and 50 is an overstatement, well, there's still a good chance that the candidate wins at least 1 or 2% of those undecideds to make up what they were overstated. So that's one thing that I do account for in my forecasts is how much of that undecided was forced and how much of it is genuine.
Yeah.
So some of these polls that you're seeing with 10% undecided, in my forecast, I take it for what it is, or sorry, in my poll averages, I take it for what it is. But in my forecast, I'm using data to figure out who these undecideds are, and I figure out what the best probabilities are to allocate.
Okay. Now, before I ask you for your analysis on Pennsylvania, there's one other. I found a really cool analyst. And he specializes in Pennsylvania. I'm
Yeah.
guessing that you're familiar with Joshua Smiley as well, or Smithley. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you know what's funny? Someone tagged me on one of his posts and
Yeah.
said, "Hey, you should follow Real Carl Allen because he does a lot of similar analysis to you." And he said, "I follow him. I read his book. I've already incorporated." Can you believe that?
That's
That
awesome.
that's wild for me. That is absolutely wild for me. Someone that I hadn't like actively talked to, and he really does great work. That work that he's doing right there, the early vote analysis and things like that. I try to do that, and I'm okay at it.
Yeah.
But other people are better at it, and I use their work to inform some of the things that I'm doing on election night instead of trying to reinvent some of the things that they're doing. So he's doing awesome work. He is definitely kind of what I would consider an up and coming. I don't even know how old he is. I don't know if he's in college or if he's
Seems like a young guy from what I can tell, but
yeah, I'm not sure, but in terms of like how the quality of his work versus
yeah.
how well known he is, he's definitely like an up and coming analyst.
I'll put a link to his Twitter profile in the show notes. But for folks who aren't looking at it, it's at Blocked Freak, which is Blocked FREQ on Twitter. And just so folks who are listening and not watching know what we're looking at, Joshua puts up empirical information. He gives a little bit of analysis after he puts that up. What he's putting up, in this case, it's the last one I saw was Pennsylvania 2024 general election day 12. These are early votes, vote by mail splits. So far there's about 1.1 million votes cast. Now I think what I'm looking at here is blue Dem are registered Democrats who've returned their votes, which I think what he's saying here is 684,724, which makes up about 62.7% of Democrats who asked for vote by mail. And correct me if I'm wrong about what I'm reading here.
Oh, you're right.
Okay, so Republican voters so far have submitted 328,074 votes, which is 56.7% of Republican registered voters who've asked for vote by mail. Independents are 110,711, which is 47.3% returned. Let's see, am I missing something here? Oh, he does give the vote by mail splits and the ballot edge. So far, the ballot edge is 356,650 in favor of Democrats with return edge of 0.6, I guess it's 0.6%. And then he gives some analysis, but what he's providing is empirical, hard data. And then you can derive what you'd like from there. One of the interesting things that he said in past posts, one is that we'll likely see more GOP registered voters voting for Harris then we'll see Democratic registered voters voting for Trump, and independents seem to be breaking for Harris more so than Trump. But that's not empirical. That's from maybe other information that he's gathering and projections he's making. So what do you think about this last post that he made?
Yeah, so vote by mail and early vote data varies by state.
Yeah.
So depending on the state you're looking at, some states provide you a ton of data in terms of registered voters, age, gender, and method of voting. But Pennsylvania is one that provides a good amount of data. So all we know is the party affiliation of these people who have returned their ballots and the method of voting, whether they voted early in person or whether they voted by mail. What we're seeing in Pennsylvania is rather expected Pennsylvania Democrats are returning ballots much more quickly. They've requested many more ballots than Republican candidates. What's interesting, and we'll talk about this more when we get to other states, is Republicans for the first time in 2024 are actively encouraging their supporters to vote early. So the term that's being brought up a lot is this cannibalization.
Okay.
Traditionally, Republicans vote in huge numbers on election day itself, which means the vote by mail and early vote numbers that Democrats have, that gives them a huge edge going into election day. And the hope is for Democrats that that lead is big enough to sustain that pressure, that day of pressure from Republicans who tend to vote in person. But the question is, with Republicans voting earlier more often now and voting by mail more often now, are they just moving these votes on election day to voting early? That is a very hard analysis because we have no comparisons for it. There's no precedent for this election. Just like there was no precedent for 2020 with COVID when record number of people voted by mail, 2024 is another, we have no precedents for this. So this analysis is very important. But whenever I get the question of what does this mean, is this good or is this bad, I can only give you a feeling. I can't tell you for sure what it means. Okay. And in Pennsylvania, these numbers look very promising for Democrats. But all that being said, election day rolls around, Republicans get better than expected election day support, and it could end up being extremely close.
Yeah. So going back to this list of polls from what we can see, one is I'd love your analysis from what you've seen so far, and maybe if there are other polls that have jumped out at you in addition to the ones that we're seeing in the first dozen or so, or the most recent dozen or so that 538 is showing. Just large takeaways analysis about what you're seeing in Pennsylvania right now.
I have a specific pollster that I want to shout out for doing quality work, but I have to preface it with a kind of a caution.
Okay.
No pollster, no matter how great they are, no matter how quality their work can possibly be better than a polling average. That's the unfortunate reality of this field, is that polls by nature are an inexact tool, an imprecise tool. In chapter 4 of my book, this concept of an ideal poll, even a pollster who conducts everything perfectly by a scientific measure is still subject to fluctuation. So we have to value, unlike 538, who says that the best pollsters are the ones who best predict the election result. We have to get away from that mindset. We have to get away from that literary digest. They predicted it, therefore they were good.
Right.
We have to get away from that mindset, because the best pollsters often will not be the ones who are closest to the result. We have to value good methodology, which is to say we have to be process-oriented more than we are results-oriented. So on that note, with that out of the way, I have to give credit to the Bullfinch group. They have done something that I have been advocating for since I first started researching this topic. And what they've done is they've taken their poll data and they have transparently laid out the entire process. They did not weight their data. They did not. They reported everything exactly as it was, and they said, "These are our results. If you want to weight them based on this, you can do it this way. If you want to weight them based on this, you can do it this way. But we are being totally transparent about our data," which is the exact opposite of what some other polling companies do. And they say, "Here it is." Now, this is not to say whatever their results are. Honestly, I could not tell you if their results are favorable for Harris or Trump, and I think it actually varies by state. But what they are doing in terms of transparency, I think, sets a beautiful standard for hopefully how things can improve in this field. Pollsters and polling companies should be competitive. They should compete, but they should compete for who does the best work, not who makes the best predictions.
Yeah, that makes sense. So just so folks know, the Bullfinch is showing recent polls, October 11th through October 17th, 600 sample of likely voters. There were two that came in, same likely voters 600 sample. Harris 49, Trump 48 in one. Harris 49, Trump 49, even in the other. Now, is their questioning such that they're asking folks to make a choice if they had to, as opposed to allowing folks to say, I don't know yet, or undecideds?
I think they do ask that follow-up question. If you are undecided and you had to choose, who would you vote for?
Yeah.
Their acronym their acronym is FUCT, fully unweighted, completely transparent. And they lay out every single question that they asked, the results to the question, what the possible results mean, and they also even go as far as to say other pollsters do it this way, and here's why we don't think that this is, or why we think being transparent is important, because you can very easily see how a otherwise good pollster who wanted a result favorable for a certain candidate could nudge the numbers just 1 or 2 points in their candidate's direction, and it looks entirely legitimate. It is entirely legitimate, but it might not be the best quality of work if we're valuing transparency.
Okay. So yeah, the big question now is, what is your forecast telling us about Pennsylvania as we stand right now?
Yep. In my forecast, I have Harris favored in Pennsylvania. She is a 68%. At 68% probability to win Pennsylvania. That is tied with Michigan, to get ahead of ourselves. Pennsylvania and Michigan have different underlying factors. Michigan tends to be a little bit stronger for Democrats, but there are some things working against Democrats there. But in Pennsylvania, everything that I've seen in the polls tends to point towards Harris being a favorite. That being said, that doesn't mean Harris is going to win Pennsylvania by 5 comfortably easy. But I will say in my forecast, it is more likely that Harris wins by 3 and have her getting to 51%, Trump at 48%. It is more likely that she wins by 3 than that she loses by 1.
Why do you say that?
It's highly unlikely that Trump gets above 50 to 50 and a half. In order for him to win by more than 1, he has to get above 50 and a half. It's very hard for him to surpass that ceiling because of some of the demographics that he's losing. He's losing Republicans. He's losing independents. All he's doing is building his base.
Right.
To his credit, he has done a decent job of refilling some of the voters that he's lost. But I don't think there's a good bet that it's going to be enough in those blue wall states. And Pennsylvania is probably Harris's strongest state right now in the blue wall, that is, of the swing states. So it's interesting the way the forecast numbers play out. But again, that being said, Trump has about a 1 in 3 chance of winning Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
That 1 in 3 chance is very close to the likelihood he wins the election, because Pennsylvania is that important. Right. So just because it's more likely that Harris wins doesn't mean that Trump getting to 50 and a half and winning by 0.5 or 1 point isn't possible, because it is, unfortunately, for my background and my desired outcome, very possible.
Yeah. No, we talked about it last time. If he's got a 32% chance, it's kind of like, in baseball, if you're hitting 320 for your career, you're going to the Hall of Fame. I don't like that if I don't want him to win. Before we move on, I wanted to tell you about something else that's important. Money. Specifically your money. In all seriousness, I wanted to tell you about my advisor and my friend, George Meza. George runs Meza Wealth Management. And with George, it's not just about money. It's about helping us manage our present and plan for our future. And unlike a lot of other firms out there, George and I actually have a relationship. He knows me, he knows my family, and I know his wonderful family. I also know his firm and the incredible team he's put together, from his chief investment officer to some of the other great people in his office, like Jessica, their head of operations, that are always there to help me and with all aspects of our portfolio. You see, the thing is, I got a lot going on. I guess we all got a lot going on, and I don't have the time to watch our investments all day, every day. And even if I did, I don't have the experience and expertise that George's team collectively has. So we get the entire Mesa Wealth Management team, all their expertise and all their integrity. And again, it's based on George knowing me personally, knowing my goals, and even the kind of risk that's appropriate for me to take, which, by the way, could change from one season to the next. And they're on top of all of that. So if you want George Mesa and Mesa Wealth Management to be on your team, just visit their website, mesawealth.com. That's MEZA wealth.com, www.mesawealth.com. And that will also be in our show notes, so you can check that. And now, back to our show. So the next one I had was Michigan. So again, I'm going to jump over the average, the poll average, and I'm going to go down directly to the list of some polls.
Right.
Quinnipiac, good reputation. Again, I see immediately that there's over 1,100 likely voters sampled. And then in these two polls conducted between October 17th and 21st, very recent. And I see in one that they have Harris at 50, Trump at 46. That's interesting. Oh, okay. So that'll make sense, because I did have a question about a certain portion of the population in Michigan. Their second poll, again, 1,136 likely voters, conducted same time, October 7th through 21st. And they have Harris at 49, Trump at 46. So again, a couple things that jump out at me: 4 points of wiggle room in one and 5 points of wiggle room in the other. Now let's see, there's a drop down here. Okay.
That's going to be your third parties for sure. Yeah.
So Stein at 1, West at 1, Oliver at 0, Terry at 0. So that covers in the second of the Quinnipiac polls, that gets us to 49, 46. That gets us to 97 accounted for. So one of the questions I have about Michigan is, in the primaries, I think it was called the undeclared, people who voted as a protest vote, that might have otherwise voted, in this case, for Democrats, and they voted as undeclared. So how significant do you think that portion of the population is, or are there other factors that I'm not even thinking about right now?
Oh, you're right on. In Michigan, there is a large Muslim population who have traditionally been pretty reliable voters for Democrats. But because of the issue in Gaza, because those voters feel that Biden has not done a good enough job in the Middle East, and specifically in Gaza, they wanted him to not win the primary, number one. But number two, I don't think most of them will follow through and vote for Kamala Harris. I think those voters will either vote for Jill Stein or they will not vote. I don't think most of them will vote for Trump, but I do think Jill Stein will perform better in Michigan than she does in any other state. Not necessarily because she's a better candidate for that issue, but just because she gives those voters an option. She's spoken to their concerns, and they have refused on a matter of principle to vote for Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or the Democrats. Some of them will follow. Some of them will kind of come home, so to speak, and vote for Kamala Harris. But I would be shocked if Jill Stein doesn't get at least 100,000 votes in Michigan.
Okay.
Most of which would have previously been considered reliable or somewhat reliable Democratic voters because of that issue in Gaza. Now, the question then becomes, how important is that for the election? Could that 100,000, even 200,000 wouldn't be surprising to me. Could that number of voters be decisive in the election? The probability is greater than zero, right? If we're talking about a scenario where Harris is narrowly ahead in Michigan before accounting for those, then yes. But the best probability, the most likely outcome, is that 100,000 is not decisive in the election outcome. My median forecast has Harris winning Michigan by about 2.5. So that has her getting to about 51 again. That's again accounting for Jill Stein taking about 1% of third party vote there. So the possible outcomes, the range of possible outcomes in Michigan, just like Pennsylvania, yes, it is possible that Trump gets to 50 and wins. But the question about Muslim majority voters is a big one when I forecasted the UK elections back in July, there were a ton of constituencies. Their constituencies are like our districts, where Gaza was a huge issue. A lot of voters in those constituencies traditionally had favored Labor, which are pretty close to our Democrats, and they didn't come home. They voted third party. They voted independent. And it was in numbers that were largely unexpected by other forecasters because they assumed that they would come home. The reality is they didn't. And in Michigan, I don't think most of them will either.
Yeah. Now, one of the things you talked about later in the book is how you did a whole chapter on Utah 2016.
Yeah.
But as a way to talk about the significance of third parties and how they tend to perform. One of the points that you made is that third parties, independents, tend to underperform once it comes to election day. So as I look at the one from Quinnipiac, it says Stein at 1%. By that thinking, there's another one, pretty recent one, October 16th through 20th, 705 sample likely voters from Morning Consult. This one has Harris 49, Trump 46, Oliver 2%, Stein 1%. So those third parties, it is based on past performances of third parties. The Olivers and the Steins might end up at 1.5%.
Right.
So that's a
Yeah.
safe projection to make. So again,
Yeah.
so your overall forecast has Harris winning the state. What's the overall percentage? What kind of you said by 2.5, but what is the likelihood of her winning that state in your forecast?
About the same as Pennsylvania. I'd have to double check my numbers. I just redid my presidential forecast with some updated data. Her numbers got a little better in some places, a little worse in some places. The top lines were about the same. And I think
about 68%.
Pennsylvania and Michigan are very, very, very close at about 68%. Yeah.
Okay. So we could go through all of the swing states, but I figured one more that I am really interested in is North Carolina.
Yes, that's the wild card right now. That's a
Yeah.
very interesting one to talk about.
I've been thinking about North Carolina as 2020, what Georgia was in 2020, North Carolina might be in 2024.
Yeah.
So again, I haven't looked at this list of polls. One at the top is SoCal Strategies. It is a partisan poll. I don't know anything about them. Just looking down this list of recent polls, Morning Consult again. I've heard good things about. Again, I am not a pollster or like a professional. But it's just, from people that I respect, the Mike Madrids of the world, or looking at the ratings on 538 Morning Consult. And again, I'm looking at certain things based on reading your book, and other things I've learned about polls. It's a recent poll, October 16th through 20th. Over 600 is a number I look for. So this one has 702 likely voters. By the way, you mentioned earlier when I said that advantages and disadvantages of likely voters versus registered voters. So before I get into North Carolina specifically, what advantages and disadvantages there?
Yeah. So when you're taking a registered voter poll, because we have access to voter rolls, like this is public information, it's very, very easy to take a random sample from a registered voter roll. So when you're contacting a random sample of registered voters, you should expect some of those registered voters that you talk to probably won't vote. So the numbers in the registered voter poll are considered less reliable, and I'm going to get into why that's good and bad in a minute. The numbers from a registered voter poll are considered less reliable than a likely voter poll because the likely voter poll is designed to throw out some of the people who won't vote.
Right.
The challenge with that is the pollster themselves has to build a model of who is likely to vote and why.
Okay.
And that introduces the potential for some error if a pollster says, I think this person is definitely going to vote, and then they don't, that introduces the possibility that they have brought an error into their poll that wasn't previously there. The registered voter poll is just if all registered voters voted, which we know won't happen, but if all registered voters voted, this is kind of how things would play out. But we know they won't. This is what the likely voter model that we incorporate says, based on this demographic turning out, based on this demographic turning out, et cetera. And fortunately, when we are talking about a general election in a swing state, turnout is generally about 70 to 80%. So it's hard for numbers to move more than 1%, maybe 2% from registered voter to likely voter.
Yeah.
But famously, there have been some pollsters who make some questionable assumptions about what a likely voter is, and they'll throw out an entire city like Philadelphia in their likely voter model, and their numbers go from, say, 48, 47 Harris to 49, 46 Trump. And that's a really, really big move from a registered voter to a likely voter, and it's probably a mistake. Registered voters and likely voter polls in general elections, very close to an election, are quite close. So we shouldn't give a ton more weight to one or the other.
Okay.
But likely voter polls are generally a little bit better if we're talking about looking at what we think is going to happen in the election.
Okay. Now, one other thing I wanted to underscore here is when you had, let's see, the Redfield poll for North Carolina, recent one, October 16th through October 18th, 843 likely voters. This one has Harris at 45, Trump at 48. Now, the wiggle room part of it, there is only 1% Stein. So 46, quick math here, you're better at it than I am. 46 plus 48 only gets us to
94.
94.
Yep.
So 6%. Now, two mistakes that are often made, and in some cases, you know, the 538s or the the Nates insist upon is either by splitting the remaining 6% or by assigning them based on, you know, the percentages that we've seen so far. Why is that a wrong way to do it?
We cannot.
Proportional is the word I was looking for.
Yeah. So when we're talking about people who are undecided, we cannot, if we're doing good analysis, and we should not, if we're doing even not good analysis, assume all of those voters fit neatly into a distribution.
Right.
So one of the main questions that is asked, and this is so ironic, and one of the reasons I laugh sometimes when I do some of this analysis, one of the reasons that polls can sometimes truly be inaccurate is this non-response bias. Non-response means I am not going to answer my phone. I am not going to take a survey. I am not going to talk to a pollster. So the question becomes, do people who take surveys and respond to polls, are they in some way different than people who don't respond to surveys? And that introduces a certain source of error. Yeah. And this phenomenon is considered now obvious to analysts, and they say, oh yeah, there might be good rationale to say that these people are different. So my next very, very short step to that, and as I say, okay, so people who declare or offer who they plan to vote for in an election versus people who say they are undecided, might that sliver of people who say they're undecided also have something in common? Might they have some underlying traits that would lead you to believe that they might strongly favor one candidate, they might strongly favor the other candidate, they might strongly favor not voting? But we can't make these assumptions without data to support it. So in the US, the standard assumption, the literal, not exaggerating assumption is that undecideds will always split evenly between the two major candidates, or else the poll was wrong.
Right.
That's not true. We know it's not true, but that doesn't stop them from doing that analysis. So when I look at this poll, I see that this pollster has Trump at 48. Trump will probably get at least 45, 46%. He will almost certainly get around 48%.
Yeah. So you see that as a ceiling for him in this state? I see that as a floor.
Oh, as a floor. Poll numbers are an estimated floor.
Okay.
Estimated floor. Estimated is a big term because we know the margin of error is plus or minus a few percent. So plus or minus 3% means Trump's floor could be as low as 45.
Right.
That's what I'm looking at. That's what I see in this poll. Poll averages are always better than individual polls. But even looking at this individual poll, I say, okay, his floor is around 45, his ceiling's around 51. That tells me nothing new. That tells me nothing new. We need lots more data to figure out where the real floor is, where the real ceiling is. And all of these polls, if you take an average, you're going to get about 3 to 5% undecided. Who do those undecideds favor? Well, if 3% of the 4%, let's say there are 4% undecided, if 3% of them favor one candidate in a very, very close polling average like we have in Michigan, well, that would lead to that candidate winning by 2 or 3 with no poll error. With no poll error. That analysis does not exist among experts in the field. They would conclude, because undecideds did not split evenly, that the polls were wrong. That is a very, very simple arithmetic mistake. I think you can use that as an adjective. But anyway, that's a very simple mistake that we shouldn't make. Right. So don't assume undecideds will split evenly. Don't assume anything about undecideds, because we don't know why they're undecided. All we know is about how many there are. In a lot of these states, they will not split evenly. Whether they favor Trump or whether they favor Harris could make the difference between a close election and a blowout.
Okay. So do you have any indications? Are we starting to see the late breakers, the latest breakers, people who don't decide until the very last minute, how they're actually breaking? Let's say it is 4%. Do we have any indications how the late breakers are breaking?
Yeah. So who these late breakers are is the first question that you should ask.
Yeah.
In 2016, the late breakers were largely conservatives who didn't like Trump.
Right.
And they ended up coming home and voting for Trump. In 2024, those late breakers, the undecideds, are mostly moderate independents. These independents don't like Trump, but they might lean conservative. So what Harris is doing in actively courting this 2 to 3 to 4% undecided, she's basically giving them permission to vote for her. You notice that she's campaigning with Liz Cheney.
And Olivia Troy, Adam Kinzinger.
Yeah. And she's doing these things to get these conservative leaning but truly independent voters who, again, we have a hard time understanding it because of maybe the bubble that we live in. But these people, when it comes time to vote, they could see themselves voting for Harris or voting for Trump. So they could do that. And right now, the best evidence that we have is they will slightly favor Harris. They're starting to break that way. Harris is messaged effectively on this. Trump is extreme, etc. And she's getting more of them in her court.
So interestingly, I've been thinking about the influence of people like Liz Cheney and a lot of the former Trump staffers and even cabinet secretaries and Republican leaders. There are scores of them now. And I couldn't say for sure. There's a lot of skepticism about whether they are persuading Republican or right of center or independents. But I do think, because of my training as early on as a stockbroker, I see them more so as what we call leading indicators more so than persuaders, meaning they're an indicator of a number of other people in the population, a number of other voters that may have aligned similarly as Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney and Olivia Troy historically, but this election is different. And in my own conversations and a number of the focus groups, there's a lot more folks who are talking about how significantly the events of January 6th affected them and how serious they think this election is based on what happens leading up to that day and since that day. So again, my own take on it is I'm not sure whether Liz Cheney is persuading voters so much as she is an indicator of a lot of other voters there. Does that make sense?
That's a very, very good point. That's a very good point. And some of my friends on the left don't like that Liz Cheney is such an active part of Kamala Harris's campaign in 2020. John Kasich, if you remember, there was kind of a controversy that he was speaking at the Democratic National Convention endorsing Joe Biden. And I said, guys, if you are serious about winning and you want to make sure that Trump doesn't win, if that's your goal, then we need these moderate, rational, conservative-leaning people on our side, because we know for certain that these people vote. These people vote. These people will walk through 10 feet of snow, walk walk over broken glass, whatever metaphor you want to use, to vote. They will vote. We have to do what we can to earn their vote. On that note, really quickly, Pennsylvania, we talked about it a few minutes ago. Pennsylvania has a closed primary, meaning only people who are registered members of that party get to vote in that primary. And we looked at Joshua's breakdown of how Democrats were voting, how Republicans were voting, how independents were voting. In Pennsylvania, closed primary, 157,000 Republicans, registered Republicans, voted for Nikki Haley. That number and that fact doesn't sound too extreme or impressive until you consider the fact that Nikki Haley had already dropped out of the race.
Right.
She did not campaign. She was not trying to win. These people voted in a primary in which they knew their vote couldn't make a difference. The candidate who they voted for could not possibly win the nomination, and yet 157,000 of them still showed up to vote for Nikki Haley. That is not a good sign for Donald Trump's chances in Pennsylvania.
Okay. So
what about leading indicators?
Back on North Carolina, what is your forecast for North Carolina at this stage?
Back to North Carolina. North Carolina has a very good chance of being the closest state in the election. North Carolina has drawn a lot of comparisons to Georgia in 2020. Georgia, I think, was decided by about 0.3% in 2020. North Carolina in 2024, there have been a lot of polls coming out, a lot of polls with Harris at 49-50%, which is extremely impressive and for me unexpected. So my analysis kind of incorporates the polls, but also I have to consider the fact that Trump got over 50% in North Carolina in 2020, which means in order for him to lose North Carolina, he has to have lost support. I do think there's a good sign of that. But North Carolina is very, very, very close. It will likely be decided by 1 or 2%. In my forecast, I have Harris as a slight favorite there, 54% or 56% or something like that. The analogy that I always give people when I'm talking about probability, because probability, 55%, 65%, who cares? Well, I always break it down in terms of, would I rather flip a coin if I had money on the outcome? Would you rather flip a coin, or would you rather put your money on a Harris? In this case, in North Carolina, I would narrowly favor the wager on Harris.
So the image that immediately came to mind is the roulette wheel, and you can bet on black or red, but there's always the zeros.
There's always the zeros.
That's essentially, if you're at 52 or 54%. The zeros make sure that the house has that 52 or 50. I don't know what the exact percentages are, but you'd rather be the house than the gambler could get lucky and it could be his day. So
exactly.
So without going into detail on especially those other 4 swing states, Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Nevada, what are you seeing the overall race as it stands right now? What does your forecasting tell us at this point?
Harris is still a favorite. I have her at 65%. The reason that I'm slightly lower on Harris in the election than I am in Michigan and Pennsylvania is because I think Wisconsin, if the blue wall cracks, Wisconsin is the most likely culprit. That's been my analysis for the past couple months. I think some other forecasters have kind of reached the same conclusion recently, very recently. But again, if Harris wins Pennsylvania, Michigan, which I think she has a very good chance to do, but narrowly loses Wisconsin, Wisconsin only has, I believe, 10 electoral votes, which means North Carolina or Georgia or Arizona could patch that blue wall, so to speak. So I do think Harris is still a solid favorite. I think that, again, if I were flipping coins versus wagering on the election, I would strongly favor betting that Harris would win. The most likely outcome is that Harris holds the blue wall and wins several or all of the other swing states. That's the most likely outcome. There are plenty of scenarios where she loses Arizona or Georgia or North Carolina or all three. Nevada is a really, really, really interesting case, and I'll give you kind of the 30-second breakdown as to why it's interesting. Nevada has gone blue the past several elections, but it's been relatively close. It's unanimously considered a swing state. But the early vote in Nevada has strongly favored Republicans, far more than years past. And the question, again, just like we did the math in Pennsylvania, how many of these GOP registered Republicans will cross over and vote Democrat? It's not just that calculation. It's also how much are they cannibalizing their election day vote. So in Nevada, in the past, Democrats have had a huge advantage via mail vote, and then it was very, very, very close after Election Day. But now it's looking like it's going to be much closer going into Election Day. The question in Nevada will become, do they have enough Election Day votes? Do Republicans have enough Election Day votes to hold the lead or to make up for whatever small deficit they may have? Yeah. So a lot of interesting things that are happening in this last 2 weeks, and I'm doing my best. I'm doing my best to keep everybody on the leading edge of it without having a heart attack.
Yeah. So you're favoring Kamala Harris. By what percentage do you have her right now?
In the election overall?
Yeah.
65%. 65%. Just under 1 in 3. So again, prediction markets. I have lots of opinions and facts about prediction markets. They're all favoring Trump right now. They all have Trump as a 60 to 65% favorite, which is almost the exact opposite of what I have. That is, to me, pretty irreconcilable, to use same term as before. It doesn't make sense. There's no math that you can do. There's no rational reason why Trump would be considered a favorite. But what I think is happening, and I don't judge people for it, I think people are betting for entertainment. I think people just like you might want to bet your favorite football team to win a game, people are treating this as entertainment. Yeah. The prediction market, the election outcome. I don't like it, but I understand it, that it is such an important event that it's like Super Bowl. That's right. That's the best analogy I've seen people make. They're over $2 billion on Polymarket. Kalshi is legal in the U.S. now. They have several tens of millions on the election, I believe. So, I mean, we'll see what happens. But prediction markets in 2022 did not do well. Even 2024, prediction markets haven't done well at predicting things. Yeah. Who the vice president will be, whether or not Biden will stay in the race. So it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of all of this. But for right now, I am laser focused on making sure my forecasts are good, making sure I'm informing people in a reasonable way, not in a way that that gives them too much confidence or not enough in this case. Yeah. I have some thought. I haven't really taken the prediction markets very seriously, partly because I'm a measured risk taker. I used to, when I first started playing cards, it was blackjack. I played a lot of blackjack when most of the there were enough houses in Vegas where if you were counting cards in a 1 or 2 deck game, you could actually get the odds slightly in the player's favor. But once they started making most of the houses dealer hits on all 17s, can't resplit aces, can't double after split, things like that. And then, most of the houses are like 8 deck games. It just became a lot more difficult to find the games that could have been conducive to the player. So one of the reasons I started playing poker was you always look around the blackjack table and you say, man, if I could play against the other players, I would make so much money. So in poker, it's, well, if you don't know who, if you don't at my poker table. Well, poker players say, if you don't know who the donkey is within the first hour, it's probably you. So yeah, I've been in that situation a few times. but we're just playing for fun, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But that's why the prediction markets is a lot of donkeys at the table, frankly. So I don't take it very seriously. But I know we're running up against time here. Before we start to wrap it up, there are a few Senate races that are interesting. I'm still bearish on the Democrats' chance in Montana. I
Yeah.
am not as bullish for Allred as a lot of other folks are. And largely because of what I'm seeing in the polls. Cruz I'm consistently seeing Cruz at 50 and 51 in Texas. And then the one that was interesting for a second was Nebraska. I wondered if the independent, what was it? I forgot the independent's name off the top of my head. But then I started looking at the polls, and I don't know if that's if the independent has as realistic of a chance. But Montana, Texas, Nebraska, are those some of the ones that you're looking at? And if there are others, what are you looking at in terms of the Senate?
Yeah, Democrats are up against it in the Senate. The cards that they were dealt, to use the poker analogy, if you don't have good cards, it doesn't matter how good of a player you are.
Yeah.
You can punch above your weight class. I keep using 6 different analogies, but you can if you don't have good cards, but you're a good card player, you can hold your own. But even if the Democrats have a very, very good election, there's a chance that they don't win the Senate because of the states that they have to win. Sherrod Brown in my home state of Ohio, he's a slight favorite to win in Ohio. Slight favorite means slight favorite, but that would only get Democrats to 49 seats. They need to win, as you pointed out, one of Florida, Texas, Montana, or Nebraska, in addition to winning Ohio, which is far from a given. Of those 4 states, the best chance in my forecast for Democrats to hold the Senate, the best chance is Nebraska. The long shot. I have them at 33% to win in Nebraska, which is much, much, much higher than 538 has. Their forecast was just released today, which I just found about an hour before we went on, and they have Osborne at 5% to win in Nebraska. And that's not a good number. I don't think that's close to accurate, because Osborne is an independent. He's pretty well separated himself from the national conversation. But Fisher, the Republican there, she's made some unforced errors. She was actively campaigning to get Nebraska's 2nd district to give up their electoral vote and go statewide. How do you think people in Nebraska's 2nd district feel about that?
Right.
They're a district now. They get a ton of attention. They get a ton of money. They get campaigns to visit because their one electoral vote does matter. If they went statewide, Nebraska would become Kentucky. They wouldn't get much or any attention. So she's made an unforced error. She's going to lose some votes because of that. She's still favored because Nebraska, Trump's going to win by 20, 25, 30 points there. But Osborne has a very, very real chance to win in Nebraska. That is Democrats' best chance of picking up that 50th seat. To your point about calculated risks, Harris campaigning in Texas is a beautiful calculated risk. Beautiful calculated risk. If I'm sitting at a table with 5 other pros, I look down at a mediocre hand and I shove all in. That's probably my best chance.
Yeah.
That's probably my best chance of getting lucky and pulling something out. That's not to say that Democrats are going all in on Texas, because they're not. But Harris has pretty well accepted that she's probably going to lose in Texas.
Yeah.
That's realistically in play. That would be a pretty dramatic blowout. But Allred will run ahead of Harris, whether he runs ahead of her by 1 point, 2 point, 3 points, whatever. But by squeezing those margins of how much she runs ahead of him, if she gets to 46, 47, 48 in Texas, that Senate race becomes interesting. I only have Allred at about a 20% chance of winning that race. Cruz, to your point, is polling at 49, 50, 51. It's unlikely that he doesn't get to 50. And there's a very good chance that we're in a situation where we're like, God, we lost Texas Senate race by 2 freaking points. It was that close. there's a good chance that we're in that boat. If all red wins, he won't win by a lot. He'll get to 50 and a half, 51. 52, I think, is like a very, very high end possibility, but there's a better chance that Cruz gets to 54, and it's not really a realistic play. But the fact that Democrats are campaigning there, the fact that Harris is going there, that tells me they're taking the calculated risk of we're going to show some strength. We are not going to run away from campaigning with our Senate candidate, even though we know we're not the most popular candidate. We're going to try to turn out a bunch of voters. We're going to try to turn out as many voters as we can in these blue districts and try to make this competitive. I think it's a brilliant move. I'm really glad that they're doing it.
That's awesome. That's really interesting. Some interesting races to see. I'm afraid we don't have time to get into the House, but I knew this would be fun. I knew getting into the weeds with you would be a ton of fun for me. I hope it was edifying for everybody else who's listening and watching. Before we take off, a couple questions. One is, do you have any questions for me?
Do I have any questions for you?
Sorry, I forgot to tell you I was going to ask that.
Yeah. Let me think here. Let's see. I'm trying to think of a good election-related question that I could ask you. What chance do you think Democrats have in Florida?
I haven't really thought about Florida, partly because I think it's greater than zero. At the presidential level?
Yeah, presidential.
It's greater than zero, but I haven't looked at it because I think it's fool's gold. It's proven again and again. I think that state has gone the same way that Ohio has gone. So I mean, if you gave it more than, I don't know, even with a 2 as a first number, in the 20% range or above, I'd be surprised in any models that are showing anything north of 20%. So,
yeah.
But I honestly, I haven't looked at that state for that very reason. I'm just not taking it very seriously as a chance for a Harris pickup. So am I wrong about that, or?
No, you're right. It's not looking strong for Harris there. There is a Senate race that's rather interesting in Florida, but abortion on the ballot, man. Abortion on the ballot. They need for the initiative to pass. I think it's Amendment 4. For the initiative to pass to get rid of the extremely restrictive rules on abortion that they have in Florida, they need 60%, 60%, which is
right.
which is a very large majority, which I think will motivate Democrats to turn out. So Florida, to me, is one of the hardest to forecast because it's trending red. Trump won it by 3 to 3.5. It wasn't a blowout like we might think. It was about 3.5 points, I think, in 2020. But the demographics are favoring Trump. So we would think it would fade to maybe Trump wins it by 6, 7, 8 points. But with abortion on the ballot, that makes the uncertainty, that widens it out for me. I wouldn't be shocked if it was very close in Florida, but I'm with you on the probability. I don't think it's over 20%. I think it's probably in the 10 to 15% range, but it's a really interesting wild card. It's not going to decide the election.
Yeah.
But boy, won't it be interesting because Florida counts their votes very, very fast. Won't it be interesting if Florida's too close to call on election night? That would be a very, very big leading indicator
right.
of Democrats might be doing better than we expected, or better than the other forecasts and prediction markets expected. So I think that's one thing that we can look at on election night.
That'll be interesting. Yeah. I mean, there's so much. Florida, if anything, I'd love for other states to look at Florida's model in terms of how they count their votes. The lessons that they learned from 2000 they were really important lessons. So I give that state a lot of credit. I just think from other professionals, the hacks as they call themselves, hearing about Florida's Republican Party is much better organized than Florida's Democratic Party. So I think the Democrats have a lot of work to do if they want to be competitive at the statewide level in Florida. I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, if we saw a Democrat win statewide in Texas before we saw a Democrat win statewide in Florida. But that's just some some 30,000 foot takeaways, initial thoughts, but got to study it a little bit more to have a more informed take. Before we go, want to make sure folks know how to follow you, find more info about the great book, The Polls Weren't Wrong, your Substack, and all the great work that you're doing.
Yep. I am at Real Carl Allen, Carl with a C, on all social media, CarlAllen, at Real Carl Allen on Substack, on X, on Threads, on pretty much any social media. I have been doing weekly chats on Instagram Live and X with my followers about the book, about the election, etc. Very close to the election, I will be doing those daily or maybe every other day to hopefully shed some light on what's happening, what matters, what data doesn't matter, how things are looking for the election. And also on my Substack, I've been posting forecasts. I post very, very good analysis that I've been told is kind of a good outline for how I think and leads into, if you like my analysis on Substack, you will really, really like the book. The book, The Polls Weren't Wrong, is available on Amazon or wherever you would like to buy it. Let me get out of the way here so
there you go.
A little better.
Good stuff.
On Amazon or wherever you would like to buy it, direct from the publisher, Barnes & Noble, etc. Selfishly, I have to say selfishly, because it is a little bit selfish to ask someone to buy my book. It's honestly very, very, very good. It will change the way polls are analyzed. It will help you understand how polls are done. But the selfish ask that I have to do is that this book selling well will anger all of the right people. And this book selling well, honestly, in all honesty, could make the difference between whether this analysis is incorporated in the next 2 to 3 years versus the next 10 to 30 years.
Yeah.
I've seen how slow these wheels turn in science and in analysis. My background in sports data, I've seen how slow people are to adopt better methods because of how things have always been done. So they need to be forced. They need to have that pressure coming, not just from me. It has to be coming externally as well. So if you like my analysis, or even if you don't like my analysis, but you want to understand poll data better, if you want to understand how things really work, and understand why this analysis of, oh, this candidate's up 3, therefore they're a big favorite, why that analysis is junk, that is what you will learn if you buy the book.
Absolutely. The Polls Weren't Wrong. It's a great book. As you could tell from this conversation, I've learned a ton from it. It's helped me evolve my own thinking in the way that I look at polls and assess data that we're seeing. And I've become a more discerning consumer of news and what I'm watching on news shows and reading on other sites, et cetera. And by the way, Carl is a great follow. So at Real Carl Allen, I love, we mentioned it before. I love seeing Spicy Carl on there. It's a great follow. So it's great to hang out with you again, Carl. And this is really fun. Thanks for doing it, man.
For sure. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. Let's do it again before the election.
Oh, that'd be fun. I don't know if I'll be able to squeeze it in, but because I always have to do so much homework to prepare for a smart dude like yourself. But yeah, that'd be fun. Maybe we could squeeze one in. But yeah, thanks again for doing this. And for everybody else, thank you for tuning in. If you dig what we're doing, remember to follow the show, write the review. You can join the conversation on Patreon, watch us on YouTube at Politics and Religion. Check it out, watch, subscribe, be one of the first 1,000 subs on YouTube. Get some TP&R swag and all that stuff. Really excited about all of it. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.